All righty. Facebook, YouTube. We've got Danny here. We call this free therapy. Is this what this is?
Sure, yeah,
okay, so
let's do it.
I get free therapy also. And so I'm going to ask a personal question.
Okay.
And then we'll jump into some of the other questions. We got a bunch of questions loading in the comments, so we'll get there. What do you do when you're a believer and you're full of faith? You're just like, God can do anything. And then you have a loved one who is walking in deep despair or depression, because maybe those two are similar. How do you like do both? Like, how do you still walk in faith and still be like understanding of someone who's walking through it? Because I think that we have those moments, right, where it's like, okay, why do you need medicine? Because God can take care of it. So like, how do you handle that? Sorry, I know this is just a random question, but I want to throw it your way.
No, that's fine. You're going to get kind of a range of different reactions from people, but if I was to keep it just really simple, if you have a loved one that is walking through a season of depression or despair, some of these are going to sound really cliche, but they're so important, I think, to repeat, which is first and foremost, reminding them that you are there to walk alongside of them. And being honest, I think, with saying, I may not understand everything you're going through and I don't have the answers, but what I can do is I can support you in getting the help that you need. I can be here to remind you that you are loved and that you are cared for. I can be a sounding board, and don't feel like you have to have the answers or that you need to like pull out the Bible and say, this is what scripture says.
Beat them with the word.
Exactly. And you don't have to be the fixer of their depression. Most people just want to know that, like, hey, who you are, I still see you and I'm with you and I can get you the help and support you.
That's real good. All right, first question.
Yes.
Thanks, Eugene, for this question. It's a great one. So when you start noticing that you're moving closer to despair, so let's just say we're thinking about Jesus being the bridge, and Jesus is trying to help get you over here, but you feel like you keep going the other direction, or maybe off the bridge. Like, how do you like realize that, and what do you do in that moment?
Yeah, that's good, because again, sometimes I think we get a little bit confused. They're like, is this sadness, is this depression, is this despair? What I would say is one of the first, I think, telling signs that we're moving more into this place of like clinical despair is think back to what that word despair means. If I find myself heading into this place of struggling to have any hope, but probably even more so than that, when I find myself almost getting fixated on this idea of questions that don't have answers, or this absolute fixation on, it doesn't matter what anybody says, my therapist, my family, my friends, I am in a place of believing there's no purpose, there's no hope, that there is no meaning to any of this, and you almost have this like dark negative lens over what you see in everything.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so then next question here is from Eric. He's one of our PA folks. He says, when dealing with despair, what is the best way to keep strengthening your faith?
Oh, that's so good. Okay, so I told you this earlier. I'm going to try to not go like too heady or too nerdy, but I do a lot of what's called existential therapy, and the reason why I think this topic of despair hits so close to home is because it's something that philosophers and existentialists have talked about for years, and one of the things they say across the board is despair is essentially a spiritual crisis. So
even if they're not spiritual.
Yes.
Because
I mean, let's just be honest, I don't know who out there, maybe you're a Christian, maybe you're questioning, maybe you have a completely different faith background. I know I work with clients of all different faith backgrounds, and you name it on the spectrum, I've worked with it. But they call it a spiritual crisis because back to that idea of despair essentially disconnects us from who we are. That you can't not identify as a spiritual crisis because we're literally questioning hope, purpose, meaning, and these are all the things that life is built around. And so how do we maintain our faith in the midst of despair? Well, I mean, this is going to be probably a much bigger conversation, but you almost have to go back to that place of creating a sense of meaning and purpose in your life. And one of the first things that people like Soren Kierkegaard or Viktor Frankl or anybody like Carl Jung, all of these who are philosophers would tell you, the first thing to do is almost hit the pause button and step back into that place of connecting to your faith.
I love that. Hit the pause button I think that's good. I think someone, please write that in the comments. I think there's times where you just keep running, right? You're
Yeah,
on
we have this
rapid
like
race.
sense of urgency around it. And by the way, pressing into your faith and like hitting the pause button, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden everything gets better automatically. It's about slowing down and almost like that verse that you described. Actually, I just made that connection. It's almost like that moment where Jesus just sat in the quiet. He sat with it, right?
No, seriously. So that verse, I remember reading it, and I'm an NLT, usually ESV if I'm studying. And I was like, man, let me just see how they wrote it in the Message, because that's such a, it's even more practical. Thanks, Justin, for throwing that up there. But even at the beginning of this passage, as he's walking, literally, crowds are following him. People are screaming. And instead of getting hyped by that, he's like, I know people are walking in despair. I know there's issues that they're walking through. So I'm just going to sit quietly, right? I'm going to sit on the side. And as you're coming up, it says in that passage, as they came up, he started. And he starts with, you're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. I mean, come on, many of us have been in that place.
One of the hardest things I think for a lot of my clients is understanding that a lot of times when you're dealing with uncomfortable emotions, our instinct is to run the other direction, or like, I need to find the problem, like I need to fix it. Like we want to be away from that uncomfortable emotion, that deep place of despair. And while it's important that we talk about how do we actually move out of despair, first and foremost, one of the things that I know we do even in therapy is we just sit in it for a minute. And we just sit in the quiet and we just almost imagine sitting across from our despair and just being with it and having compassion for the fact that we're in that place.
I hope this has been good for you. We're still got a little bit more time left. But as you're talking, I'm just thinking, man, like I can just see some of the people who are walking through these moments feeling like, here's some things I can grab onto. I think that, as a speaker, I try to think, man, what are things that people can grab onto? I can give the hope, I can give the faith. And then there's those moments of, okay, but how do I fix Monday? After I'm out of the gathering. So I think that's great. Vanity, another great question. She asked this. We got 4 minutes left. What are some ways we can remind ourselves to focus on the light when we fall into deep despair?
What a beautiful question. And if I was ever to say that is like the question that should be asked around despair, that's it. So Viktor Frankl, if you have never read his book, Man's Search for Meaning, I will tell you, go out today, get that book and eat that book up. It is so powerful. And one of the things he talks about is despair is basically suffering without meaning. And so the antidote to despair is giving your life a sense of purpose and meaning. So when you are in that place, every single day, just one step in front of the other, it's about how do I find a sense of meaning in the midst of my suffering. And one of the best ways that you can start creating meaning in your life is to focus on this idea of purpose. What is something right now in front of me that I can actually start injecting myself into to give my life a sense of purpose? Maybe that is in serving the church, maybe that's in your relationships, maybe that's in art. Whatever that thing is, the way that we actually can walk through that place of despair is we have to give our life a sense of meaning and purpose.
So good. I want to elaborate on that, but I'm not, because you got a bunch of questions in here. So maybe we'll try to jump through these quick.
Okay, go fast.
We've got just a few more minutes. And so first one, Q&A. Is it sinful to question God when dealing with despair? I thought it was a great question.
You
let me do that? Yeah. Is it sinful to question God when dealing with despair? And that's why I posed at the beginning of our time that questions are normal. And I think that sometimes people think that God is like afraid of our questions. Like he's like, oh my gosh, like what am I going to say? Because you, for this, Eric, you're feeling like crap. You're in despair and you're frustrated and you're questioning God. And I think that what God says in those moments is he says, I want to hear it. Just like when he was walking on the hillside and he sat down and think about the people, you don't see the dialogue that was there, but maybe there was a moment where people got to say, you're saying this, but here's what I'm walking through. Or maybe Jesus had a conversation with someone in the crowd as they were walking. Like we forget just how real those times were. And I think that God is excited when you are feeling that way, because it even goes back to you. Like I think you had said this a little bit ago, when someone walks in and they realize, okay, here's where I'm at. Like this is the place I'm in. I'm in deep despair. Great. Now it's the progress to say, this is where I am. Now I can see the next step that I'm going to take. And it goes back to what we say here at our church. I help people identify their next step. So for you, Eric, or for anyone else that has that question, your next step is just realizing it's okay. Realizing God's not frustrated that you're asking that question. Being excited that God is saying, I want to hear what you're dealing with. And so a great question. Okay, let's move on. What is your number one suggestion, this is from Christine, of how to help someone with despair?
Okay, number one suggestion, back to that idea of purpose. There's, as odd as it sounds, there's actually a lot of practical things that we can do when we're in a place of despair. But the number one thing across the board is you have to start with that idea of sit with that concept of how do I find purpose? Purpose can be in everything from our day-to-day activities, which reminds us of who we are and the things that are the most important to us. Because you have to think about this, despair robs us of our hope, it robs us of actually being motivated, it robs us of living life. And so the first and most important thing you have to do when you're in a place of despair is to push back on that place of being stuck and start with this idea of what are the things in my life that I can actually have an impact on right now that give me a sense of meaning and purpose, and focus on that.
It's so funny, like I'm listening to this and I'm like, do I need to change my series for May? And do we just need to do this every week in May and walk through this conversation? Because it's such a good conversation. For those who are just jumping in from Zoom, my mind is being blown right now. And I would encourage you this week to listen back through the gathering for this section of it. But I think this is a great question to end off on. And this is from Rosalind. And I just know this family because they've gone through some different things. She's, job issues, like all around the board, which a lot of people have dealt with, right? And so the question that she asks is this: when do you decide that chemical intervention is necessary? I just thought, when I read that, I was like, ooh, that is a good question.
I'm so glad. I just made a video about this actually on my Instagram, my teeny tiny little Instagram that means absolutely nothing.
The videos are really good though. You should watch them if you need to.
But one of the first things I tell people is, number one, don't self-diagnose. That's really important. But also, there is a very sometimes real need for medication. But I think sometimes our instinct is when something feels off, we want to jump to medication. So what I would tell you is if you think you're in that place, number one, sometimes it's absolutely really helpful to be on medication because it just can help level things out so that you can then do the deep work. So it's not an cure-all, it's how do I balance things out so then I can get the help that I need. So what I would suggest is actually meet with a therapist who is trained to actually do a proper assessment, and they can give you the tools. And
hold up, you telling me I shouldn't go on Google and type in, I'm feeling this way, and then find those drugs on the street, you know what I'm saying? No,
if you want to go into a massive anxiety spiral, then yes.
Okay.
No, I would definitely suggest is reach out to somebody. Like we're literally trained to do a proper assessment with you and to give you really basic tools. And then if we see that those tools aren't working, typically the next step is, hey, let's have you meet with either your doctor or a psychiatrist or a psychologist and do an even more thorough assessment, because it might be that chemical intervention is really helpful because sometimes because of genetics or just because the way that your brain just happens to work, it's nothing that you did. Medicine can actually be a really great tool, and getting the proper assessment for it though is really important.
I love it. Well, hey, can we give it up for Danny right now? She did a great job. Hey, for those I can see, should we have her back sometime? Yes? Hey, maybe? Yeah. Okay, great. Danny, thank you so much. High five. You can go ahead and head off. And hey, guys, we are so excited. We do have another song that our team recorded. And the song we're going to do today is How Great Thou Art. And I love just the realness of this song as we're thinking about this deep despair. And Justin and Karen have a little dialogue about it as they're going to walk into the song. And so why don't you guys get your hearts ready. I think in the middle of talking about practical ways to discuss despair, again, I'm full of faith too. And I want to say that today can be your day of freedom. I want to say today that there's a God who says that there are moments where he can touch you in a moment. If you look all throughout scripture, there were times where God just touched someone in a moment and their lives were changed. And so right now, maybe you're walking through deep despair. I'm going to pray that God touches you in a moment. And as you walk out of this gathering, not meaning that you're not going to still need some other help, but that you feel the comfort of God, because when you're walking in deep despair, I believe that Jesus is bridging the way to endless comfort. Let's walk into this worship song.